Good morning, everyone. If you are looking to make sure you're in the right place, this is the Built Green webinar session for construction and demolition recycling with King County Solid Waste and Green Tools. I'm Sonia Auclair, and we will get started in just a second once we kind of get everybody in the room. And while we're waiting for that, I'll go over some quick housekeeping. Everyone, please mute if you're not talking. We will have some question and answer time throughout the webinar. I know during Kinley's presentation, he will have a couple Q&A breaks. And then during some other times, we'll have also some at the end. If you want to kind of record your question, please do so in the chat. Feel free to do that throughout the presentation. Nina will be monitoring that. She is with Built Green as well. And she will provide answers live, or she may save them until the Q&A session at the end. And then at the end, we will address as many questions as we have time for. And now we'll get started, and I will introduce Kinley Deller, who is a waste reduction specialist with King County Green Tools. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming today. I am part of King County Department of Natural Resources within the Solid Waste Division, and I'm part of the King County Green Tools team, which I'll talk about now. The Green Tools team, we kind of see it as our kind of a consultant branch in a way. We advise on internal King County projects, and we also do a lot of consulting and advising on external county projects. Our mission, as it says here, is to work towards a model sustainable community where both the public and private sectors seek to balance development and natural resource protection in the built environment. We have a couple of main things that we focus on. One of those is regional code collaborations, working with the jurisdictions within King County and also outside of King County in our region on developing codes. We have a community-wide green building support program. And then we have King County internal green building program. And then there's the construction demolition program, which I'm a part of. So basically, when it comes to construction and demolition materials, we have a number of different things we're trying to achieve. The biggest one is kind of a state mandate, a requirement, I guess you would say, and that as a solid waste division, it falls to us to properly manage the waste that's generated in our jurisdiction. And in this case, for our program, we're specifically required to manage the C&D waste generated in King County, so it does not negatively impact public health or the environment. And the jurisdiction for the office that I work in is King County, not including this, the city of Milton or the city of Seattle. Katie Kennedy at Seattle, specifically Seattle Public Utilities, is my counterpart there, and I work very closely with her. And we try to keep our programs in sync to reduce confusion and to make things easier for everybody trying to manage construction demolition materials in the area. But we are different jurisdictions, and we end up having some different policies based on other things that are happening in our jurisdictions. The King County goal is to have an 85% diversion rate of construction demolition materials by 2025. And we say diversion, that means not going into a landfill. We also, there's a few other gray area things in there that count and don't count for diversion rates. There's material that's sometimes generated from processing construction demolition material called residual, and sometimes that can be used as alternate daily cover, is what they call it, and that's spread at the top of the landfill at the end of the day, and that is not counted towards diversion rate. However, taking wood and turning it into a product referred to commonly as hog fuel, which is then burned for energy, that is considered part of the diversion rate. We don't really consider it recycling, but we consider it part of the diversion rate. Anything else at this point that is burned as a fuel is not considered diversion. We probably won't have time to get into that today, but just be aware of that. The goal for King County is a zero waste of resources diversion by 2030. A lot of municipalities around the country have zero waste goals. Ours specifically was denoted as zero waste of resources, basically meaning if it has value, it shouldn't be going into the landfill. Of course, discussion as to what has value and what doesn't. We'll touch base on that a little bit later. My slide is not advancing. Give me just a second. Okay, so this slide kind of shows the lay of the land in terms of where materials are generated and where they flow. So on your left, you have a construction site, a job site. Materials can be source separated. We often see this with metal. We sometimes see it with wood. We encourage it for other different materials based on the phase of your project. So those pretty much go to a single commodity recycling facility and then onto a recycling commodity processor and market. Usually things going through that stream, through the single commodity stream, we assume to have a 100% diversion rate. Sometimes when we calculate it at 95%, but it's usually generally assumed to be all recycled. There is some residual, we understand, but it's usually fairly minimal. The middle path is when materials go to a commingled processing facility, also called a material recovery facility. Now we're specifically talking about construction and demolition processing facilities. Materials that go there are commingled, either commingled recyclables or sometimes recyclables mixed with a little bit of waste. We look at the residuals coming out of those facilities, make sure that what's coming out of those facilities is in compliance with the materials that are banned from going to landfill, which I'll talk about in a bit. And those materials either go by truck to the landfill or they go by truck to the rail yard where they're then put on train and taken to a landfill. Down at the bottom, you can see we have the transfer stations, the C&D transfer stations, and it should really just be the non-recyclable waste material that is going there. So it goes there, it does not get processed at all. It goes, gets loaded into either a truck or directly into a rail car and then taken to the landfill. And we now have an option where material can go directly from a construction site to the rail yard. We don't have an arrow for that. And my coworker Canyon will talk about that in a little bit. All right, so the King County Construction Demolition Program in the form that it's in now basically started January 1st of 2016 when a new ordinance came into effect. That ordinance was updated a little bit in 2021, became effective January 1st of 2022. We'll touch briefly on what those changes were. There wasn't a whole lot that happened, but the direct shipment of waste is one thing that did change. The main components of our program is that we banned construction demolition materials that have stable markets from going to landfill. We established a system for designating C&D processing and waste transfer facilities. City of Seattle has the same system, but they use the word certified. And then we also established a construction demolition enforcement program, dedicated funding for that. And then as part of this, it wasn't specifically in the ordinance, but part of our current program is an emphasis on construction demolition market development. So the materials that are banned from disposal in a landfill: clean wood, cardboard, metal, gypsum scrap. So this is new gypsum scrap, not demolition scrap. It shouldn't have paint. It shouldn't have anything else on it. No mud. If it's new scrap, actually a little bit of mud is fine. But for the most part, they just went new, clean, dry gypsum scrap. And then asphalt, pavement, and concrete. So these are all the things that are, according to the King County policies, currently banned from going into a landfill. So if you're generating any of these at a job site or at a demolition site, actually, they should be going either directly to a single stream processor or being commingled and getting processed at a processing facility. Can't really read this, I apologize for that. What I will do is get you guys all links later when you are sent the link to the recording of the presentation. We'll have some good information for you. This is a flyer that we have, and it shows where all of the designated or certified C&D processing facilities and C&D waste transfer facilities are located. Things have been changing a lot recently with the system, and so we've got some updates to do, including on this flyer. But we do try to get that information out there along with the addresses and phone numbers for the facilities. City of Seattle keeps track of all of the diversion rates for the certified / designated facilities. This is the annual report for Q1 through Q4 of 2021. So you can see here the different rates, and there's I could go through and spend a lot of time talking about each facility and why the rates potentially are the way they are. But we won't go into a whole lot of detail there. And some of the names have changed for these facilities since last year also. But I just wanted you to know that there is a path. Again, we'll get you the URL, but you can go to the City of Seattle website and look at what the current quarterly and annual diversion rates are for each of the different facilities. I should also point out that part of the reasoning, part of setting up the system of designated facilities was to be able to have some control over where the materials are going, because we have the requirement of making sure that the C&D waste is being handled properly. We needed to set up a system where we could say all the materials need to go to the designated facilities, so we can keep an eye on those facilities and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that they're sending the waste where it should be going and where it's going to be managed appropriately. So that's why the system is in place. And these diversion rates are a way for you to check and see what's actually going on with the facility. We get monthly reports from each of the facilities. We do audits periodically on their data, and we do other things to keep an eye on what they're doing. So there is King County and City of Seattle in 2015, 2016 set up the system I just talked about, but there's also a national certification system called the Recycling Certification Institute, or RCI is usually what it's called. It's a third-party national system program for evaluating the diversion rates at facilities. We have 2 facilities in our area which are currently certified. One of those is Lautenbach Industries up in Mount Vernon, and the other one is the Recovery One facility down in Tacoma, now owned by DTG. And then there are, I believe, four more of the DTG facilities, and both the United facilities that are currently they're registered with RCI, so they're going through the process of becoming certified. It's basically a year-long process they have to go through before they can actually be certified. And we're working on getting all of the processing facilities certified within the Recycling Certification Institute, so that it's a third-party thing. King County and Seattle aren't directly involved with how all that is happening. In King County, another great resource is the What Do I Do With, or the WDOA. I usually just refer to it as the What Do I Do With. You see here in the bottom right, there's a link specifically when you go there for construction demolition debris. I should point out, most browsers now, if you type in King County WDIDW or just WDIDW, it should take you to this database. And this is the best source that we have right now for finding commodity specific facilities. So if you want to just take wood someplace, or you want to just take metal someplace, you go in here, you click on the construction demolition debris, that'll give you a list of the different materials. You can click through that to get to specific facilities. Enforcement. All right, Canyon, are you ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kinley.
Yep, there you go.
All right, so appreciate that. So C&D, our C&D enforcement program, there's a few aspects of my position that I follow to ensure compliance with Title 10 and facility agreements within King County. I'll just kind of give you, a brief overview of some of those aspects. General flow control, I help to ensure waste generated within King County, except for Seattle and Milton, enters at authorized waste collection facilities, focusing primarily on construction and demolition debris. Constructionmonitor.com is a very useful website that we use to compile various permits, and specifically I examine demolition permits within King County's jurisdiction. You can go in there, we subscribe to it, pay an annual fee, and I go in there and set the parameters for every city within King County's jurisdiction, and I, click on the type of permit I want to see, and in this case, it's demolition permits. And then I go and visit those sites, and in some cases do follow-up visits. A lot of times there's a delay, and when the demolition will occur for a variety of reasons, especially the COVID era. And when I visit those sites, I ensure that recyclable materials, the banned materials, your clean wood, your clean gypsum, your metal, your aggregates, are separated or sent to facilities that can process the C&D waste. On occasion, site visits can lead to a direct disposal request, but I'll get into that a little more later. We have a C&D waste compliance program, and through conducting surveillance, I confirm that C&D waste is directed toward the proper channels, and if necessary, take enforcement actions when regulations are not adhered to. Additionally, we have facility agreements that I mentioned earlier that cover material recovery facilities, but we also have agreements with a couple of transfer stations, C&D transfer stations. And on a quarterly basis, I conduct inspections at those facilities to ensure that the composition of waste entering the transfer station are in line with what they're permitted to accept and in line with the facility agreement. And that's really just to ensure that the banned materials are not being directed to those transfer stations, and that we're maximizing recycling here within King County. With enforcement, with the solid waste division, take a progressive approach with an emphasis on education, educating contractors, haulers, property owners of King County solid waste requirements as it relates to the handling of those materials. All right, and direct disposal, King County just got a Title 10 update that codifies our requirements for direct disposal. And here we are, okay. So King County directs direct disposal within King County, and there are a few parameters that have to be met before contractors or demolition contractors can just use direct disposal on site. And so I'll just go ahead and run through the list briefly. The project has to exceed 6,000 square feet of building space that will be demolished. A waste diversion plan is required, and in that plan describes how material will be recycled during demolition and is submitted to the county by the contractor or any subcontractors acting on behalf of the property owner. The project must be planned in a manner that maximizes recovery of readily recyclable materials and adherence to disposal bans. As part of the review process, the division may at its sole discretion conduct a deconstruction assessment using trained staff or consultants. Within 60 days following completion of the demolition activities, a waste diversion report accompanied with receipts from landfill and recycling facilities where the C&D materials were disposed of must be submitted to the division. The report must verify where C&D was sent in compliance with the diversion plan. And there are, a few landfills that are approved ahead of time. We have currently Columbia Ridge Landfill, Roosevelt Landfill, the Findlay Buttes Landfill, and the Wenatchee Landfill. And that is essentially it. And I'll be open to questions later. Go ahead, Kinley.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kenny, why don't you go ahead and take a couple of questions now, if you'd like.
Oh, sure.
More.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions on our enforcement program or direct disposal? And if you'd like, you can just put it in the comment section.
Kenyon and Kinley, we had a question from Joe regarding any drop-off locations near the Columbia River Gorge that could bring recyclable C&D to the proper facilities.
Are there drop-off facilities near the Columbia Gorge? I don't know. We primarily just look at the drop-off areas servicing the King County region.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could talk to my counterparts down in Portland and see if they've heard of anything, but I'm not aware at this point.
And it looks like Michelle had asked what triggers the allowance of direct disposal. Well, as I mentioned, project size is, a key component to that. And then the other major thing there is a diversion plan that lists where all the banned materials that you will generate on site will be going, whether it be brick, scrap metal, gypsum, whatnot. Did that answer your question, Michelle, or did you have a little bit more there?
Yeah, mostly answered my question. I think is it when the project is so small that it has limited waste, or is it when the project's so big that they can't track everything? I just want to know when it's a viable solution for a project.
Gotcha. I think that when you have a large demolition project and you have an intermodal trailer that can, accommodate 25 tons of material, a small house demolition, which is, roughly 1,500 to 2,000 square feet, wouldn't, it wouldn't be economically viable for, the contractor to, make use of an intermodal. It'd just be a partial fill. But primarily we want to direct, those materials going to, facilities like DTG and United Recycling so that they can run them through their processing, their sort line, pull out the banned materials, and it ensures compliance with the materials ban we have here in King County.
And Heather has her hand raised. So Heather, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you both. Very interesting. And Kenyon, I didn't quite catch what you said at the beginning of this particular slide. You said something about due to title something, and I was just trying to understand what you meant by that. Yeah.
Okay, so there was a portion of Title 10, that Title 10 in King County, is solid waste and how it's handled, where it's collected, and every aspect that guides solid waste here in King County. So prior to this amendment, which took effect in early January, direct disposal was not allowed because we have a C&D ban at landfills, particularly here in King County. And we want to ensure that, those materials that can be processed and sorted out and, eventually recycled are in fact recycled. So that's why, we want to ensure that contractors are making use of the processing facilities and not just sending things to landfill directly at that site.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
And one last question before we move on. Brent just wanted clarification in terms of when the banned material rule began.
I think for, so it's kind of a flexible list. It's our division director takes a look at commodities, whether it be wood or metal, and he can see, what the values are of those, and if it makes sense to keep it a banned material or not. Like cardboard is a banned material, and I think that went into effect in 2016. Is that correct, Kinley?
Yep, that's correct. Yep, and the county code specifically states that the solid waste division director will publish a letter stating what the banned materials are. We've evaluated a number of times whether that list of materials should be changed, and we have not made a recommendation to the division director that he change what that list is, and that the specific list from the division director is there's a link to it on our website, which we can give you a link to later too. At one time, there was talk of also having a ban for carpet, plastic film, and asphalt shingles, but we've been continuing to monitor the markets for those materials, and they're not mature enough yet. All right, let's move on. If my advance button will work. All right, contracting and permitting. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that you might want to keep in mind when looking at contracting and permitting, depending on the jurisdiction that you're working in and who you're contracting with. So if you're contracting with King County, or if you're doing a project in City of Shoreline or potentially some other cities in the near future, you'll need to do, or City of Seattle also, you'll need to do a salvage assessment or have a salvage assessment done. Most of the time, this needs to be done by a registered salvage verifier. That system is still a little bit in flux in terms of who exactly is a certified salvage verifier. So everybody has been pretty lenient on that at this point, but we're having trainings this summer and fall to create a list of registered salvage verifiers. And some of the larger companies will probably want to get some of their own staff certified, but we need to have a list of who all is certified to be able to do that. Deconstruction assessments are also required by some jurisdictions or some contracting entities. And this is the salvage, I guess I should explain these a little bit. Salvage assessment is basically going through the building, determining what has potential value to be pulled out of the building prior to demolition or deconstruction. And then usually the material is reused. A deconstruction assessment is more detailed. It will often include a look at the structural elements of the building, what of those can be reused. It includes recommendations on how the building could be systematically taken down or deconstructed in order to save the most materials of value. So yeah, and there's also a couple of people who do deconstruction assessments right now. If you're interested in having a deconstruction assessment done, contact me. I still have some budget and I have a consultant who can go out and do those on a free basis at this point. I might ask you to do a case study in return, but it is a service we're still providing. On the waste management reports, most projects in the county now require waste management reports. And that's a matter of keeping track of all the materials that are going through your project, being generated by your project, where they're going, adding it all up, and then providing the receipts to document it, or sometimes just having those receipts available in case there were ever questions about where the material was going. And really the waste management reports are a way to make sure that the materials are going where they're supposed to be going, that they're going to the designated facilities, or that the single commodities are being sent directly to the recyclers or the single commodity processors. Yeah, that's all I probably need to say on that. Incentive programs. Okay, Sonia, it's almost your turn. So USGBC LEAD program obviously has points that you can get for tracking your C&D materials. The International Living Future Institute, their Living Building Challenge program, also has points for tracking your materials. I believe both of those programs also have requirements now in terms of how you manage your materials and making sure that you're documenting that. But today we're really here to talk about Built Green. So I'm going to pass it off at this point to Sonia. I'm going to stop sharing because I think she has some slides to share. So take it away.
All right, so I am with Built Green. I'm the Built Green program manager if you have not met me before. And we're just gonna quickly go through some of the program, like a Seattle program that's relevant, that aligns with Built Green, and some of our waste management and deconstruction and salvage credits that builders can utilize to not only meet some of the requirements King County has, but also to gain points on their Built Green certification checklists. So the one program that a lot of our builders are familiar with, but has recently changed as of last year, to require or encourage more deconstruction and salvaging in terms of waste management, is the Seattle Green Building Standard, also known as the Director's Rule. It really aligns with Built Green credit. So almost all of these requirements here, or not, they're not requirements, they are, you have to pick one of them to do. So of these, you can get credits for every single one in the checklist. So if you choose one of these options, most likely you will get a credit on your Built Green checklist. So it really aligns with that program. So one of the things that you can do is you are required to meet one of the following: either retain the existing structure or reuse it. You can relocate the existing structure that's on that in lieu of demolishing it. You can deconstruct by removing specified number of board feet for reuse or salvage. You can also remove and dispose non-load bearing lead painted materials. Mostly this is in terms of siding. And the other option you have is to use at least 200 board feet of salvage material. So that's sort of, instead of focusing on the demolition side or deconstruction side, this last option is like during construction and your material selection. So it's a flexible kind of parameters that you can choose one of these to do. And again, all of these will give you points in your Built Green checklist. So the first sort of set of waste management credits we have is in relation to kind of our recycling. So we do have a credit now that gives you points for using an on-site 3-bin separation system, meaning you'll have, instead of the 2 that are required, you'll have a third one. So you'll have your traditional landfill and maybe a commingled recycling, but then you would have a third bin that is a phase appropriate source separation bin, meaning that while you're, processing materials, you may have a bin, there's no size requirements. It is phase specific on what type of material you're doing, but it's designed to collect anything that you're going to source separate at that phase in the construction timeline. So for example, it could collect wood during framing, or carpet during carpet installation, light bulbs, or drywall, any of those sort of like things that you're doing at a phase in the project. So that's a 3-bin system you can get points for. The second is pretty familiar with most of our builders, where you are required to recycle job site waste and divert it from the landfill. So the performance requirement is that you need to send at least 90% of the job site waste to a commingled facility with a diversion rate of at least 50%. And there are additional points available for using a facility with a higher diversion rate. And this is sort of the standard one most builders are familiar with, using those commingled recycling facilities. The new checklist that was introduced in 2021 now allows for source separation to be combined with commingled recycling. So now, in addition to commingled recycling, if you are using that 3-bin system or source separating any of your material, you can get additional points on top of your commingled recycling practices by doing source separation for specific materials. And there is a list in the checklist that shows you what points are available for which material. And this is really to encourage higher value, like mostly separated materials to those facilities for processing and reducing the amount that might get lost in the commingled kind of sorting process. Overall, for these credits, you will want to consult the Built Green Recycling Guidelines, which is a supplemental document. It provides details on the commingled recycling procedures, the source separation procedures, as well as the approved recycling facilities and our program's approved diversion rates that they qualify for. Those rates are based on the rates that are provided by SPU and King County's program. We update them twice a year in the winter and the summer. We are currently updating them now because the Q4 of 2021 report just came out. So you should be anticipating seeing a new set of diversion rates within a couple weeks that will most likely apply probably in April, but that's not guaranteed yet. We have to figure out some updates for that for this quarter. And that is sort of the general waste management credits. So now we're going to move on to the deconstruction reuse credits. We, in the latest update, really dived down into reevaluating the deconstruction and reuse credits. We reconfigured them to make them more approachable and more usable. So we have credits for designing for disassembly, where if you are designing the building in a way using prefabricated materials or components that can be reused more easily or disassembled for deconstruction more readily at the end of the building's life, that is something that you can get credits for. Reusing or relocating an existing building for reuse is also something that we added here. We kind of changed some of these so that it wasn't that you had to reuse it on site. It can be reused anywhere, and same with deconstruction and salvaging materials. So that's a change. We do offer credits for engaging a salvage professional to conduct the salvage assessment prior to demolition, or even a deconstruction assessment prior to deconstruction. And then using a deconstruction and salvage materials for reuse. So you're going to deconstruct it, and then if you salvage those materials for reuse, not recycling, for reuse, you can get additional credits there. Reuse is we are classifying as selling, donating, or reusing the items on site or at other projects. And it could be reuse, like if you have a deconstruction service that deconstructs and salvages those material and sells them at their facility, that is also applicable. These are a list of all the credits you can get for using salvage material in your material selection on your new construction project. Building salvage lumber, urban harvested lumber, which is urban trees. It is not like telephone poles. That is what is more processed. So unprocessed kind of urban lumber. Framing lumber, flooring, doors, siding, trim and hardware, cabinets, countertops, roofing material, decking, landscape instructions. And if you have a reuse of something else, there's innovation credits available if it is not listed in one of the credits available already. We also now are implicating and adding embodied carbon to the checklist in a very concrete way. Previously, the materials section highlighted materials and efficiency that contributed into reducing embodied carbon. But in this latest version, we took that to another level. and not only reevaluated every credit in terms of how it's impacting embodied carbon, whether that's through the production of that material or the efficiency of use, or kind of maybe what it contributes to climate as a whole. So not only were all the credits evaluated from its carbon impact, but also we added a credit in relation to actually calculating the embodied carbon of your building projects. So you'll get 20 whole points for just calculating the embodied carbon of the new building. If you then go one step further and show a reduction of at least 10% off of like a baseline building of the same type, you can earn 30 points. If you are familiar with the materials section, you will notice these are very large point credits. For example, in a typical 4-star project, you need 60 points in the materials section to qualify for that star level, and 20 points are offered just for embodied carbon calculation. So this is something we're really trying to encourage. This can also really benefit material decisions. If you are trying to consider what is the greenest material, this is how you do it, is you perform a life cycle analysis and calculate that embodied carbon, and you can see what that contributes to the building as a whole, looking at the upfront carbon, not just the operational carbon, which is more the energy efficiency side. Then lastly, we do have another credit that can be combined with any other credit in the materials section, which is using a minimum of 250 square feet of carbon neutral, carbon negative, or climate positive materials. We list these 3 different descriptors because different brands and different materials will use different terms, but they all mean roughly the same thing. So just so that you don't have to guess what ones we are considering in this credit, those are the terms that you want to look for in a material specification or a material description. One of those materials off the bat is salvage materials. So in addition to the credits you'll get for using those salvage materials in the materials credits, you will also be eligible to utilize this credit in addition to those. So we're really trying to encourage reuse of both materials and structures in these credits. Lastly, one of the other considerations in terms of deconstruction versus demolition is there are specific deconstruction contractors that we know of that can help builders earn points in their equity and social justice credits in addition to just the deconstruction material credits. So if you are using a Built Green member on your projects, that can be part of that equity and social justice credits that are now also required for Built Green projects. Some of these firms may be WIMBY or MBE firms. The other thing is you can hire temporary employees or apprentices through WeldWorks or other equivalent organizations that focus on hiring and providing jobs for system impacted individuals. And this extends to first tier subcontractors. It doesn't have to be like the first tier. The general contractor. It can also be brought in by first tier subcontractors, so the deconstruction services. Or if a deconstruction firm has a standard practice of hiring system impacted individuals, they also meet the intent of this credit. So these are some ways that those contractors can help builders meet those performance requirements for those credits and can contribute to that performance requirement. The last one is if you are hiring workers or apprentices who reside in one of the 43 priority hiree zip codes. Again, this also extends to first tier subcontractors, and this can apply to any laborer that is doing deconstruction, demolition, or any work on the site. So, and it does not have to be a tradesperson. It can also be somebody else, as part of the project team. So those are the Built Green credits, and I see a lot of things in the chat, so I will pause for questions now.
We have a question from Greta Sonia that hasn't been addressed yet. Since the 3-bin separation system overlaps the commingle and source separated credits, is a builder able to claim points for all 3 credits as applicable to their project?
Yes. That's all I need to say is yes. You can claim all 3 of those together. They can be combined.
Fabulous, thank you. And I think that's all I see in the chat.
Sonia, there was a question in the chat about, where'd it go? Pam's question.
Oh, yes. The recycling diversion rates, do they apply based on the permit date of the project?
So the diversion rates are based off of the receipt date. So if you have your, if the date of the haul was dropped off at the facility, let's say June of 2019, that's the date you would look at the diversion rate, and it would fall within that period. So in the recycling guidelines, you'll see there are multiple columns because obviously our projects take more than 1 cycle now. And so you just look at sort of when those dates are implemented for the diversion rates, and wherever your receipt falls, that's the diversion rate they're able to claim for that load. And so go by that date, it's the receipt date.
That's pretty standard with other programs too. And the City of Seattle, and putting the diversion rates for the facilities on the website, they used to do it monthly, but there was a lot of variation between months, and we decided it was better to go with quarterly. And now in some cases, we're actually talking annual. So it should make it a little easier.
Yeah, Built Green typically will change its rates. We're trying to use Q4 of the King County program and then Q2. So it's roughly a 6-month kind of in between. And we do use their annual rates at each of those time points. So we're not using necessarily the quarter rates. We're using the annual rates that are changing at Q4 and Q1 or Q2. And so they are delayed, like Q4 just came out, which is the end of 2021, just came out like 2 weeks ago in February. So that's why it's sort of like in the winter and sometime in the summer, you'll see the new recycling guidelines pop up.
We had a question from Michelle. Do you have a recommended program for embodied carbon calculations, Athena or similar? Does the CLF EC3 calculator work for any of the reporting? And I'll put the link to our upcoming session in the chat.
Yes, so Nina just mentioned we are having a webinar that's going to cover two of the tools that we have pre-approved, which is EC3 and Beam Calculator. EC3 is really great for larger scale projects. It's a free, both of these are free tools that you can use. EC3 does benefit from having a very large catalog of EPDs that are publicly available in their system. But it was designed by the Carbon Leadership Forum with Skanska. And so it is kind of targeted towards larger commercial scale projects. Now, that's not to say you couldn't use it for smaller residential, but there may not be the same products in their database. Beam Calculator, however, was built by residential builders for residential builders. So that's why we're kind of highlighting those two free options. In our handbook, in that credit description, we have pre-approved other tools like one-click LCA, and a couple other, Athena and, oh, what's the other one? There's one that connects to Revit that I'm totally drawing a blank on.
Tally,
thank you, Michelle. So those are the ones we have already pre-approved that we feel are ones that are already in the market and people are using. So that's the ones we went with. Beam is still sort of getting introduced to the market. So I would, if you're interested in BEAM, please sign up for their newsletter so you can see when it comes online. There is also going to be what's called CARE, which is a calculator for the embodied carbon saved from reusing buildings. So there is also part of that can be incorporated if you are reusing a structure as part of your embodied carbon calculations as well, to show a reduction. So there's a couple different calculators and it's all laid out in the handbook for folks.
Nice, thank you.
Looks like Pam has a follow-up question. If diversion rates for a facility change during the course of a project, so that different loads qualify for different points, how do we reflect that in the checklist?
Right, so like if you, let's say your receipts are in June, we introduce a new rate in July, and then they have another receipt in August. Pick whichever one has the most waste of like the largest percentage represented. So if most of the waste was handled by that June receipt or the time frame prior to the changes, you're going to use the prior versus the lower. And then if you are, or if after that change is sort of the majority, that's what you're going to use.
I can answer Greta's question. Greta, the BEAM tool is going to be launched by the organization Builders for Climate Action, and it will be available as a web-based Google Sheet actually, hopefully very soon. They're just doing the last bit of beta testing for it, and then it will be available online. I'm going to put a link in the chat where you can sign up for their newsletter to provide you alerts with when that does go online. But they are hoping soon, and we will be, of course, having a representative from the Builders for Climate Action give a brief overview and training on how to use that tool in April.
All right, well, we are going to get back to Kinley's part of this presentation, and we can answer any follow-up questions at the end.
All right, let me go ahead and share. And I just got a message that says I'm now in the waiting room. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. I
All
can
right.
hear you.
I am just not getting my share screen controls. There it is. All right. So while I'm getting this going, one thing that I would add to what was talked about before with the diversion rates at the facilities is that, as I mentioned before, we do occasionally do audits of the facilities and look at their diversion rates, and sometimes recalculations do happen. So sometimes the rates are revised. With an annual diversion rate, that doesn't usually change things too much. But if something does change dramatically, I would encourage you to reach out to the program that you're working with and just talk about it. And they'll probably bring me into the conversation and we'll explain what's going on and figure out which rates make sense. So sometimes things happen and sometimes things change. All right, moving on. Building removal. This is one of my favorite topics. There are a lot of different ways to move a building or remove a building. Most people just think about, you've got this site, it's got a structure on it, you don't want the structure there anymore, knock it down, get it out of there. But I'd like to challenge all of you to think a little bit more about that. There's been a couple of projects that have happened in the Seattle area and in other places where they realized that they could make good use of the building that was there by just moving it to another location on the site. And then they were still able to build the larger structure that they were hoping to build. Usually this is going to be like a multi-lot type situation. But it's something to consider. And then another option is simply picking up the house and moving it. This is a pretty large house. and it's easily done with these. I shouldn't say easily, but it is done. There's a lot of demand for our houses in other places around Puget Sound and also up in the San Juans. And it's a fairly painless process to go through to work with the house movers to make something like this happen. If you realize that's not feasible, not going to work for you, then I would encourage you to look at deconstruction. And full deconstruction changed over the years. It used to be you'd have a crew of, say, 10 people taking a month to take a house down by hand for the most part. Now we just have 2 deconstruction companies, probably 3 actually operating in the area. And all of them used what we sometimes call hybrid deconstruction or assisted deconstruction. We're using heavy equipment to structurally disassemble the structure of the building, get the larger pieces down to the ground. Sometimes apart in panels, move the panels off. There's lots of different ways you can make it happen, but usually it's now a process of taking 2 to 3 people, sometimes 4 people, a week, 5 days, something like that to get a house down systematically. After that, there's what I would still call demolition. Some people call it green demolition, where you're looking at the house, you do the salvage, you pull out a thing that's non-structural. You can also pull out windows, building envelope type things, and then take the building down in such a way that the pieces that have recycling, like a lot of the interior walls, sometimes the exterior walls, once you scrape off the siding, your studs that can be sent to recycling. A lot of materials can be sent for recycling. The big thing with all of this is the hazardous materials and how you're going to deal with that. But just think about how you can take the building down and keep the materials separated as much as possible so they still have value. We could have a whole nother session talking about how to do this, and there probably will be other sessions. I've done other sessions, but I won't go into a whole lot of detail on that. But this brings me back to the point of whether you should be separating or not separating, right? The picture on the left, everything's kind of together, and on the right, obviously stuff's been separated out. I guess one way to think about this is that, you know, every time, if you look at your household recycling, right? If once it's all mixed together and you've got all your recyclables in there, I'm assuming most of you have 1 can for most of your recycling now. Once it's all mixed in there, if somebody were to say, okay, pull out the aluminum cans, it would be a little bit difficult. It'd be a little bit time consuming. Fortunately, aluminum cans are pretty easy to have an automated pick line and pop those off. But when it comes to C&D materials, it's not quite so easy. There is some mechanized sorting that does happen, but for the most part, it's people standing on a conveyor belt, going by pretty darn quick, pulling off the stuff that has value. That's how it's done at most of the facilities around here. And the more stuff is mixed together, the more effort has to go into separating it out. And the materials get handled, the smaller the pieces get and the less value they have. So if you're talking about wood, the pile on the right here was taken out of a building. This was a more labor intensive hand deconstruction done as a training for a youth program. But they're pulling out the interior wood. What mostly happens is that the building gets knocked down, it gets run over by the excavator, the material gets picked up, put in a container. They usually smash it down with the excavator to save space in the truck or in the trailer. And it goes to a processing facility. It gets dumped on the floor, and then the excavator picks it up and puts it onto the loading system for the conveyor belt. So by that point, it's been run over, crushed, smashed 4 or 5 different times. And it's a whole lot harder to get recoverable drywall at something like that. Even if it's a new construction site and you've got drywall, if it's going into a bin where everything's mixed together, It doesn't get crushed quite as many times, but a lot of it is still pretty small by the time it's coming out of there, and it's hard to recover that. Wood is a big one. There's a lot of good, clean, what we call clean wood, unpainted, untreated wood in a demolition project. Pretty much all the interior walls have unpainted, untreated wood. It's a matter of capturing that. So if you look at this building, you can see most of what's in this picture that the excavator is standing on is wood, clean wood. I would guess probably about 50% of that is clean wood. And if it were, probably more, if it were removed by hand, it could have been reused to one extent or another. And once it's crushed up, put in a container and sent off to a landfill, well, once it's sent to a landfill, you're not really getting much out of it. So think about how you can separate materials. Hazardous materials is another reason you should think about separating stuff. There's a study down in Portland that when asbestos abatement was done, that half of the buildings, when somebody went through and deconstructed them, they still found more asbestos that had not been recovered. It was friable asbestos that should have been removed. The big point here is that non-friable asbestos becomes friable when crushed. And this I got from talking with people at Labor and Industries and with the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. They have different definitions of what consists, or what it means for something to be crushed, whether it's done by hand or equipment. I believe is there where they can't quite decide. But the essence of this is that even if you have non-friable material, it really still should be getting handled separately. Katie Kennedy at SBU and I are having an ongoing discussion and bringing other folks into it, including people from LNI and Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, about non-friable material that is getting removed from houses, usually as part of a remodel project, a kitchen remodel, a bathroom remodel. You can see this picture on the right. There's some tile there. The tile was fine. Actually, with regard to asbestos, it was just the mastic that was holding the tile on. Somebody removed it in sections, which made sense. But now the requirements are such that they're supposed to put it into a yellow bag. And to do that, they're going to have to cut it further, thereby releasing asbestos fibers through the cutting process. So this is kind of a gray area. And we don't, Katie and I, to be honest, don't have a recommendation as what the best management practice is yet for a small remodel project if they're handling something like this. But for the most part, when you're talking about demolition projects, you need to get the asbestos out of there. If you can't get the asbestos out of there, there are some, very few, but there are a couple of allowances where non-friable asbestos can be left in place. And when that's the case, what I suggest is doing a demolition such that you are taking everything that doesn't have the non-friable asbestos and you're recycling that. And then the part that does have the asbestos is getting handled specially and sent directly to a landfill. You may have a discussion with the processing facility if you're going to do that. And they may require some photo documentation that the materials were actually being separated the way that they need to be, because the facilities have been getting increased pressure to make sure there is no asbestos going to their facilities. And it's up to the contractors to making sure that happens. And it's up to the facilities to ask all the right questions and require all the right documentation. Lead is more easily isolated. I should have finished that sentence probably when it's hand removed. Down in Portland, there's a program now for handling lead painted siding. City of Seattle has a new program encouraging that. And other jurisdictions are looking at how exterior lead paint can be managed in a better way. Mercury is something that still gets overlooked. A lot of it is in the thermostats, the older thermostats that are on the walls, but there's a number of other products that are out there. There's some paints that have it, but That's not very prevalent. PCBs end up in the window caulks a lot of times. They're in other places. Whatever you're doing, have a thorough hazardous assessment done and manage that material properly. If there is any lead or asbestos that's in there, or mercury or PCB, well, it should all be handled appropriately. But there are some allowances, right, for lead to be sent to a landfill with C&D material, and the very limited instances where asbestos, non-friable asbestos is allowed. And that material we want to make sure is going to a landfill, not to the processing facilities. We don't want the workers there exposed to any of this material while it's being processed. And we don't want the material getting back up in a recycled product. So the other thing that I talked about a little that we work on at King County is market development. And Terrence Darby is the third part of the C&D team, in addition to Canyon and I at King County Green Tools, and he is on vacation this week, so he wasn't able to join us. But he's been doing a fair amount in terms of market development. We did a grant program a couple of years ago to try to get a few materials, work on a few materials moving forward. But these are the main commodities that we've been looking at. Metal, both ferrous and non-ferrous. It's usually the first one for people to keep out. And it typically over the years has not needed a whole lot of help. But we're keeping an eye on it. Cardboard has become a huge issue in the last few years since China stopped accepting a lot of our fiber. And started getting a whole lot more picky. And construction cardboard, as you can imagine, is, or as you know, is a little harder to deal with than what's being generated, say, at the grocery store. It's at a job site. Usually it's hard to keep it clean. It's hard to keep it dry. But that's what it really needs in order for it to have value. When you take cardboard and you mix it in with all the other C&D materials, especially if you have an open top bin, which a lot of them are, and you're in the Seattle area in the winter, the cardboard's pretty wet and it doesn't have a whole lot of value by the time it gets to the processing facility. So if you can find the space, if you can figure out a way to do it, keep your cardboard dry, keep it clean, it can actually get recycled then. Drywall and gypsum is another commodity that we used to not pay too much attention to. We used to kind of take it for granted. A lot of the drywall subcontractors were taking the material back themselves and then taking it to a recycler. Over the last 8-10 years, I guess, even less, things have changed and a lot more people are putting it into the commingled bins. And as I mentioned before, a lot of that is not getting recovered. It's a lot harder to maintain the value when it's commingled. So it really needs to be kept separate if possible. And fortunately, the drywall part of a new house, new construction is pretty much a fairly small window. And so that's one of those times when Sonia was talking about having a phase appropriate bin on site, that it really makes sense to have a drywall bin there on site when the drywall is happening. Either that or require your subs to take it back and tell them where to take it. Yeah, there's Certainty Drywall here in the Seattle area is doing a great job of incorporating scrap drywall, new scrap drywall back into their product. And they have a lot more capacity, so they could be taking more. So I encourage you all to look at source separated drywall recycling. Plastics are a huge issue, huge nightmare in my book. There are markets developing. There's a lot of work with plastics on the residential recycling side. And we're hoping to kind of loop into that, trying to get some domestic production going with recycled materials. And I've always heard, probably for the last 18, 19 years now, that when the price for a barrel of oil is somewhere above $100 a barrel, that's when it starts to become cost effective for companies to start making stuff with recycled plastic as opposed to virgin plastic. And I heard yesterday that oil went over $100 a barrel. So while there's a huge amount of negatives that will probably come from that to how things are going these days, when it comes to trying to get more plastics recycled, it's probably a benefit. So that's one positive of that. Asphalt shingles, there was a lot of work that got put into asphalt shingles over the years. There's only 1 or 2 places right now that are taking asphalt shingles and making new material out of them. But I encourage you to look into that. And their information is on the King County What Do I Do With database. Concrete recycling should be a no-brainer. You crush it up. You can use it for road base. You can use it in lots of other ways. It can actually be used as aggregated new concrete. And some of that's happening, more of it needs to be happening. So that's another market development opportunity that we need to refocus on. And then wood is my favorite, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about wood and what's happening with wood. Yeah, I didn't need it. So there's a lot packed into this slide. Call this the hierarchy of wood uses. And this is just kind of our way of checking in and thinking about when we're talking to somebody about wood, to us with a proposal, where it falls on the hierarchy. So generally, if you were to take a piece of wood and reuse it directly in a building with no more real processing or anything else, it would be at the top. And down at the bottom, you have where wood is being used for firewood. So basically it takes a number of different components. This has not been done on, I guess if you were to look at this and start cranking the numbers in terms of carbon impact and life cycle impact and health impact and all of that, there's a lot of discussions that could happen as to where things should fall. But generally, this is how we've been seeing things. So the more processed it is, or the greater impact it's going to have on releasing carbon to the environment, the lower it is on the list. So we've been primarily trying to focus on whole wood reuse, the finger jointed board and studs, glue lambs, and CLT as kind of where we want to try to be pushing wood in terms of reuse. And yeah. So our goal, our mission within Green Tools is to build wood back into buildings. So rather than the current system where nearly all of the wood that is coming out of new buildings as scrap or from used buildings when it's demolished, almost all of that material, about 300,000 tons a year of clean wood, just about all that material is either getting buried in a landfill or it's being burned for fuel. And granted, there is some benefits compared to, say, coal as a fuel or even natural gas probably. But in terms of the value of the material, we'd really like to see it going to a higher and better use. Like that carbon stored. So here's what you typically see when you go to a transfer station or you go to a C&D processing facility, a bunch of little pieces of wood, some longer than others, some of them dinged up. And we've been talking with a lot of different people, a lot of different industries about what can be done with that wood. And what we're heading towards is making a product like this. So this is a CLT panel. In order to get it to that stage, we'd be taking the small pieces, finger jointing them together, and then building what we call lamb stock, which is basically long pieces of 2x4s or 2x6s potentially. It's usually 2x4. And then you take that lamb stock and you get into it. I have a little sample here I'm going to hold up for you guys. This was one that was done at a lab at OSU, taking salvage wood and turning it into a CLT panel. So this was done. They did stress test on it. did a lot of other testing, and there's a lot of other testing that's been going on in Europe. We've been plugging into, and there's a couple of CLT manufacturing interested in this. So it's a matter of thinking about all these different sources of wood and figuring out how to get them together in one place, which we're calling a sustainable wood business park, and get it processed. So at the center of this, you can see this the Salvage lumber warehouse, and that's really the heart of the sustainable wood business park. The idea is that the wood would be going to the Salvage lumber warehouse and go through some fairly high-tech, high-speed processing, doing acoustical assessment of the boards to determine strength, to determine where the voids are, where the metal is, cutting those pieces out. The small pieces would then go for recycling. The metal would be pulled out for recycling. The smaller wood pieces would go towards, probably towards hog fuel, although we would love to start some industries that have higher uses of really small pieces of wood in mind. So yeah, this is the general concept. I'm not going to walk you through all of it, but I'd be happy to talk more with anybody that wants to at some point in the future. And see, oh, another thing that we've done to try to make wood more usable, especially in its whole piece form, is to work with the Washington State codes. And so the Washington State Residential Code was changed. I think it was just approved the year before last, but the 2018 code, it basically says if you have a piece of used sawn lumber that's 2x6, 2x4, it can assume to be spruce, pine, fir, stud grade. It doesn't have to get stamped. You don't have to bring in a grade, someone to stamp all the wood. And if it's larger than 2x6, then it's assumed to be hem fir number 2. And we went through a lot of work, talking to a lot of people, a lot of wood graders, and getting their input, and we got it through the state building code. A similar code proposal is currently before the Washington State Building Code Council, which would apply to commercial buildings. It's almost identical language. Don't need to read it. So in summary, recycle commodities separately, use the designated facilities. It's required. Refer to the official diversion rates. A lot of the facilities create their own diversion rates. Sometimes they create load specific rates. Those are based on visual observations. LEED currently, I believe, still requires, if you're going to be doing individual load assessments, they need to be done on a weight basis, which is really time intensive and therefore costly. Sometimes the verifiers for the different green building programs won't question load specific rates, but a lot of times they will. So you're kind of rolling the dice if you're going with that. So I would go with the facility rates that are on the City of Seattle page or on the recycling, the RCI, the Recycling Certification Institute webpage. Those are the official rates. And know where your materials are going. Always know where your materials are going. So I will leave it there and open it up for questions. I think we have 9 or 10 minutes for questions. Anybody have anything?
We didn't get anything in the chat, so it is open floor for anyone who wants to step in and ask Kinley a question about the last half of that. While you're doing that, I am going to share some of our upcoming webinars coming up because we have a ton of them this year. So while you're thinking about questions you might have. We do have some upcoming Built Green webinars. We have a March 16th, which is our next one, on the cost-effective energy credits for meeting the Washington State Building Code and Built Green, courtesy of Sybil at Evergreen Certified. There is a matching blog post on our website already, but this will dive deeper into that concept. March 29th, we are going to have a webinar discussing the water efficiency and performing rating systems that are now a part of the new checklist as a pathway for performance of water reduction savings. It is a voluntary option for projects to do. So this will provide you information on those different systems. And if you're a verifier, maybe why you want to become a verifier of these systems as well. April 13th, a lot of you are interested in the embodied carbon. So we are also offering, like we mentioned, an embodied carbon calculating system webinar on EC3 and Beam calculator. You can register for all three of these at our website right now. And then I'm just going to plug a future thing that is not open for registration yet, but we saved the date for May 19th. It's an all-day in-person workshop with Sam Rashkin on how to design green homes for the new user experience imperative. This will be an active lecture and workshop throughout the day. Kinley, would you mind addressing Ryan's question, like in the video?
What about plywood?
Yes.
Yeah. So Ryan asked if plywood's considered clean wood. We do usually consider it clean wood. There's, with any of the engineered wood products, there's still discussion as whether they should be considered clean wood or not. Primarily, we've been focusing on the dimensional lumber. But yeah, usually plywood falls in the clean wood category. Other questions, comments, things we need to have a whole nother session about?
Well, if anyone has follow-up, Kinley is always available via email, as our Built Green staff as well. Thank you all for joining us today. It was great having you, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.